We are delighted and pleased to have you, Mr. P. Sainath, with us, and in the midst of the media students and media teachers. I'm just looking how many are watching live now. About 385 are watching live from different institutions apart from Christ University itself. Over to you, Mr. P. Sainath.
Thank you very much. Let's begin by looking at where we are within the media, within journalism, the state of the media, the state and the media, a media that increasingly identifies with the state and the state we're in as a society and as a nation. It doesn't require much explanation or elaboration that the public have never needed us more than they do today. Never have the public in our living memory needed journalists and journalism so desperately as in the time of the coronavirus pandemic and the lockdown that it occasioned. To know who we are as a media, just consider this. At the very moment that the nation, the public, need journalists and journalism the most, the biggest media houses of this country have sacked, retrenched over 1,200 journalists and media workers. At the very time, the public needs more journalism, not less. Not that the media were covering the migrants earlier, they never did. I'll give you, those of you who are journalism students and journalism research students, I'll give you mass comm researchers, I'll give you a little exercise. Try it. The media that you follow, subscribe to, the big channels that you watch, go back and find me. Please find me in the last 10 years. Yeah. How many lead editorials there have been on migrant laborers? How many panel discussions there were on television of the tens of millions of people who left the villages to come to the cities between 2001 and 2011 census. Indeed, the 2011 census showed us the biggest urban-rural growth differential, the greatest movement of people, greater than the recorded by the census after the partition. Please show me where those panel discussions took place. Please show me a focused half-hour program on any television channel on the migrant laborers coming to the cities. When they left the cities, we covered it. Oh yeah, sure. We were losing cheap labor. We were losing free labor. We were losing services dear to us, and that occasioned a certain outburst of middle-class compassion. Yeah. We never asked, we asked the question, why are they leaving? And by the way, they're on their way back because there are no options. Many of them will return. We never asked the question, why did they leave their homes and villages in the first place? Some of us for 20 years were trying to tell the story of the agrarian crisis that occasioned those migrations. Between 91 census and 2011 census, India lost 15 million full-time farmers, most of them falling into the ranks of agricultural laborers, others migrating to the cities. That was what created your migrant laborer classes in such numbers. In April and May, this country actually witnessed the greatest movement of human beings in recorded history. Anywhere between 20, 30 million, more than 10 million moved, between 10 and 15 million moved on the trains alone, on the Shramik trains. Okay. In the first 27 days of May, 9.1 million people moved on trains. We never asked the government of India, how is it that you are telling us that 10 million people have moved by train when on March 31st, You told the Supreme Court of India that not a single migrant is on the streets or highway. Okay, not a single. The Solicitor General goes on record in the Supreme Court. Not a single person is on the streets. Yeah. And then you're passing curfew, and then you're admitting that 1 crore of workers have shown up at the food camps. Where was the media in all this? What were they doing? They were sacking journalists, gutting. It's not that they were covering them well earlier, but they gutted any possibility of covering that seriously at all. First lesson, what you're learning here, media and journalism are not quite the same thing. One is a business, the other is a calling. How big a business is it? 20 years ago, we used to have debates. 20, 30 years ago, I've been in this profession now 40 years. 20, 30 years ago, there used to be major debates. Are the media pro big business? That seems such a completely redundant and useless debate. The media are not pro big business. The media are big business. There are media companies in this country which have rates of profit, which would be the envy of the top 30 in that Sensex. Yeah. We never, in the media for the last 25 years under liberalization and globalization, we celebrated inequality. We didn't question it. We celebrated inequality, and I'll come in a bit to the kind of inequality that you have. So you have, as of March 2019, a media industry, and by the way, in India, it's the media and entertainment industry. Yes, they are one industry, as the coverage of the Sushant Singh Rajput suicide shows you at once. The media and entertainment industry in March 2009 stood valued at, conservatively, 2 trillion rupees. That's trillion with a TR, okay? Not million, not billion. 2 trillion rupees, maybe at that time, $36 billion, something like that. So you're talking about a gigantic edifice which is actually concentrated in very few hands. There was no diversity. It had been stamped out increasingly for 20 years. It's still more diverse than the media in countries like the United States. Yes, it is, mainly because we have so many languages, but ownership has become very concentrated. And it's interesting that the publications and channels who make the highest profits, who have gigantic cash reserves, are the ones throwing out journalists in the largest numbers. The Hindustan Times gets rid of 180 journalists. The Anand Vikatan Group, 175 at a single stroke. The Times imposes pay cuts across the board. They're so concealed about it. All these champions of freedom of expression and freedom of the press never tell their readers, hey, we sacked 100 journalists this morning. They don't tell them that. Yeah. Where is that honesty and integrity in your reporting, that you don't tell your readers that we just killed half our staff last night, right? So you have, on the one hand, corporate media, which is the dominant media of this country, throwing out 1,200 journalists and saying this is the first round, there will be more bloodshed. On the other hand, there are extraordinary attacks on the freedom of expression, on journalists, not on media houses, but on journalists trying to do their job by the state and by extra or non-state actors who the state is quite comfortable with and maybe even encouraged occasionally by the state. Just between lockdown March 25 and May 30, 60 journalists, at least 60, I mean, people keep putting the counts and the count keeps increases. 60 journalists till May 30th were facing arrests, FIRs, cases, show cause notices, Some charged under extraordinary laws, not just sedition, okay? I mean, that's become old hat now, but under the Diseases Act, under the Epidemic Diseases Act. You're talking about a law of the 1896, 1897, amended slightly in 1956, but pretty much in the sense the same. The Disaster Act of 2005, Disaster Management Act of 2005, you're having you're having journalists of portals in Tamil Nadu arrested and carted off to the police station for reporting that the local hospital, the nurses and doctors did not have proper protective equipment. And mind you, the source of that story was the doctors and nurses and ward boys and ward girls of that hospital. Yeah. But 3 of them were, charge sheeted, and one was arrested. And this kind of completely fraudulent arrest, I mean, completely false charges. Apart from, I mean, this is totally aside from what's happening in Kashmir, where journalists and journalism are facing a situation none of us in our lifetime have ever experienced, not even during the emergency. So you have this, on the one hand, the onslaught and attack by media owners in trimming journalists' salaries by half, in throwing them out in hundreds, if not thousands. On the other hand, the state attacking journalists with cases, FIRs, arrests, show cause notices, charged under absurd circumstances. So journalism right now is between a rock and a hard place. Now, what is good journalism? How do we understand or measure what good journalism is? We all are, when we speak, when we write, we measure bad journalism, right? We're talking about, okay, you guys, girls and boys, you ought to be good people, you got to be idealistic people, you got to be this. But what is good journalism? Good journalism is that which you determine what is good journalism by seeing how it engages with the great processes of its time. Who were the great Indian journalists in the 20th century? Bhagat Singh, Gandhi, Ambedkar. These were people who engaged with the great processes of the time. Bhagat Singh with fighting imperialism, and Gandhi with leading the masses towards independence from British rule. Ambedkar fighting the greatest battle for dignity, human dignity ever, a battle that still continues. All of them were engaging with the great processes of their time. What are the great processes of our time? The Agrarian Crisis, the collapse of millions, tens of millions of rural livelihoods, the exit of 15 million farmers in 20 years from full-time farming, which is at least 180 days a year. That's an average of losing 2,000 farmers every day exiting the profession. The agrarian crisis, the fall in the farm population, the devastation of rural livelihoods, the pandemic, the lockdown, the ravaging of livelihoods that's now going on. We'll look at that. Yeah. Look at what has COVID-19 actually done for you. It has done something for you. COVID-19 has presented us with the perfect, complete, and thorough autopsy of the society we are. A perfect, complete, and thorough autopsy of neoliberal economics, of capitalism itself. The corpse is on the table now, and every bone, artery, vein, organ is on view. That it was there before, but this time we can't turn away. We don't have the option of looking away. We're forced to look at the corpse. we're forced to look at that total autopsy. Consider what it tells us about ourselves as a society. And please don't try discussing and analyzing the media within its own ecosystem. The media are also part of your society. It's a curious two-way thing. To understand your society, you must understand your media. And to understand your media, you have to understand your society. Who owns the media? Whose agenda do they fulfill? Whose work do they do? Consider what kind of a society it tells us we are when there is over 100 million tons of food grain called surplus stocks in the government of India's buffer stock. At the same time, that the largest number of Indians are hungrier than they have ever been in half a century. In half a century, Indians have not been so hungry as they are now. And there are huge falls in consumption, which you can see visibly. Okay? Yet you have 100 million tons of food grain stocked away, and a minuscule amount, not amounting to even 10 million or 15 million, distributed under that 5 kgs per individual, that to not all the population, about 30% are excluded. They don't have ration cards and stuff. They don't come under the National Food Security Act. Yeah. So we are sitting on this gigantic pile of food grain. And what are we going to do with that food grain? The only act of significance that the cabinet, the decision of significance that the cabinet took came on April 20th, when it gave permission, reported in the press, not discussed, no editorials, nothing. It gave permission for conversion of millions of tons of food grain. No, I'm saying millions because there is no cap. It doesn't say 5 million or 3 million or 10, there's no cap. But you can convert millions of tons of rice, specifically rice, into ethanol to make hand sanitizer. Okay? In a country where 67% of people don't have proper access to water, in areas where 150, despite a good monsoon, about 100 districts are already entering their water scarcity cycle or already entered it in April, May. You're going to destroy food to create ethanol for hand sanitizer. Of course, ethanol has other uses, which blending of fuel classes east southern states, because this conversion comes from rice. Where's the debate? This is a says, I've got 100 million tons of rice. I'm not going to flood the market with it. I'm not going to distort market prices, which would collapse if you released a lot of grain onto it. You know what's going to happen? What happened in 2002? The government of India ended up exporting cheaper varieties of grain that Indian poor eat. The Indian poor eat those poorer varieties of grain. But export to whom? Who in Europe or US is going to eat that poor grain? You know who? Cattle. It goes as cattle feed. That's what happened in 2002 and caused outrage. But it has happened again. The media, and it is about to happen again. There is no debate of why we should not release 100 million tons, half that onto the market, or let people have food grain free, which they desperately need. We're not willing to look at it. That's who we are as a society now. Yeah. You look at once the public distribution system came into being to moderate market prices. Today, it's being used to hold up the market price by not releasing that grain out. And they're giving that grain to NGOs at market prices to distribute to poor people. This is who we are. But we have a media that is completely captured by the state and by the current government that will simply not say anything to them. You see, most of India's 120 odd billionaires are people who are called rent-thick billionaires. Their money comes from what? Their money comes from exploiting public resources that are given out to them, whether it's mining or, you know, whatever projects, or uh, whether it's coal or anything else, a lot, or oil and natural gas. All your billionaires are maximum, your richest billionaires are in this rent-thick class. They make their earnings from public resources. They are not. They happen to be the owners of your media. They are not going to challenge. They are not going to challenge the government, which is in a position to control, remove, withdraw those contracts. If you think that I, as an owner of a multi-billion-dollar empire, dependent on government contracts to work and access to public resources, if you think I'm going to let my newspapers and channels attack the government or criticize it even mildly, it means you're not thinking. Okay? That's not going to happen. What has happened to your media in the last 3 decades is a rapid corporatization of the media. Guys, it's not about 1 or 2 loutish television anchors. We have plenty of those. I grant you that. And they are pretty obnoxious. But the problems of your media are structural. The problems of your journalism are structural. Yeah. They're about ownership. They're about vested interest. They're about journalism as an industry, not as a calling. They're about journalism as a revenue stream. So in the midst of all these great processes of our time, what is the great process that you see on your television now? The discussion over the suicide of Sushant Singh Rajput. Okay, that is the great process you're looking at. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, tells us that 1.6 billion of the world's 3.3 billion workers are out of work. That's the ILO tells us there has been a 60% decline in the income of workers across the world, but in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, the decline is much worse. In the Indian countryside, not the ILO, but I'm just trying to tell you that it would be 20% higher than that, the kind of collapse of income we have seen in the Indian countryside. The United Nations tells us that half the world's population is struggling with hunger. And you know where the largest population of hungry people in the world are located. These are things journalists ought to be looking at. These are things the media need to be grappling with. The UNICEF, the Children's Fund, UN Children's Fund, Children's and Education Fund, tells us that by the end of the year, you're going to see about 6,000 babies die every day by the end of the year from preventable causes. We're not concerned about that. Yeah. The FAO tells us that agriculture is taking a gigantic hit. As if you look at the People's Archive of Rural India, you'll see the kind of hit that agriculture is taking. Yet, yesterday's editorial in the Indian Express, the half a dozen TV programs that I've looked at tell me agriculture offers the one bright spot in the Indian economy. The numbers are looking so good. Oh, what do you say? Oh yeah, the numbers will look very good because in the Kharif crop, you turned out a lot of, you turned out a very good harvest. Sorry, in the Rabi crop, you turned out a very good harvest, except that it's lying unsold, especially cash crops. Millions of tons of sugarcane, millions of pounds of cotton in just Maharashtra alone are lying unsold. Where now the food security of the very farmers who grew those crops which gave you the great numbers, and people say agriculture offers a great hope, the food security of the farmers themselves is seriously eroded. And then the governments, like the one in Telangana, for instance, encourage them to repeat the same cash crops in the Kharif season as well. So you're going to, by November, have a gigantic set of unsold crops. The distress, not farmers is one, the distress of farm laborers, of the primarily Dalits and Adivasis, is going to be something terrible. It already is. It's going to deteriorate further. I want to again emphasize repeatedly that this is the way it's going to be when journalism is treated as a revenue stream and not as a calling. Why do we have these panel discussions rather than serious reporting? Because Talk TV, Chat TV is a very successful revenue model. It doesn't require you to send out cameramen and camera persons and reporters to a spot to spend weeks there to look at the agrarian crisis, when you can have 5 morons on a platform in the studio yelling at each other, which is what they're paid to do. And what does it do? You give them 3,000 to 5,000 rupees each, and you have filled an hour of programming or more on 25,000 rupees, whereas it would cost you lakhs of rupees to send people out into the countryside and really look at what's happening. The result of that is that we watched the migrants leave the cities. We didn't look at what was happening to the other livelihoods. Except for a few publications, we are still not looking at what's happened to livelihoods. We're not looking at what's happened to livelihoods of other than just the migrants. Please consider that the migrants are going back to villages where in the last 30 years, we destroyed millions of livelihoods. They're going back in search of livelihoods that no longer exist, with the result that they're going to be pushed back to the cities as cheap labor. Nowhere in the media have we seen a serious debate over the most regressive labor laws passed by ordinance in the history of this country, where 5 states have decided that workers have to work 12 hours a day, not 8, destroying the gold standard of labor worldwide, which is the 8-hour day. What's more, states like Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh have decided that you will work those extra 4 hours pro rata, no overtime for working 4 hours, no overtime for working 12 hours. It's a kind of declaration of bonded labor by ordinance. Where is the media discussing it? It cannot discuss it because the interest of the Malik reigns supreme. Interest of the Malik reigns supreme in this thing. So when you are looking at, again, when you're looking at the media, when you look at the structural issues of the media, if you're trying to understand that, if you're trying to understand what has gone wrong, I think the agricultural crisis that is going to come at the very moment, by the way, in the very 2 weeks that our pundits were telling us on the television panels, and the editorial writers are telling us in the Times and Express, that agriculture holds out the hope. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of farmers are coming out and protesting on the streets despite COVID-19, despite their fear of the virus. In Maharashtra, tens of thousands of farmers in the last few weeks, dairy farmers, have come out and poured milk on the streets of Mumbai, poured milk on the streets of their own districts. Why? Yeah, if agriculture is doing so well, it's doing so well for the wrong people. I live in Mumbai, where we pay every morning 50 to 60 rupees per liter, 48 rupees to 60 rupees per liter, depending on cow's milk or buffalo milk. Before the pandemic, before the lockdown, the dairy farmer was getting 30 rupees out of that 48. Today, we are still paying 48 to 60 rupees, but the dairy farmer is getting 17 rupees. Income has collapsed by 50%. It has literally collapsed by 50%, bringing them out onto the streets. The same is going to happen with many other cash crop farmers. You know, a good news, what is good journalism? Another way of looking at good journalism, it's a society in conversation and argument with itself. A good newspaper a good newspaper is a nation in argument with itself. Good journalism is a nation or a community in debate and argument with itself. Where are you seeing that debate and argument? You can't, because I argue that the media have a structural compulsion to lie, by which I mean corporate owned media. They have a structural compulsion to lie. Why is that? The Indian media from late 1990s shifted their wealth holdings from tangible assets, buildings, properties, real estate. They went more and more into the stock market and converted a lot of their wealth into notional things like notional wealth of shares, debentures, whatever stuff else that you want to maintain. Now, what happened in 2008 when the Wall Street collapsed? Our markets took a very big hit too. Obviously, we are totally interlocked with them. When that happened, the media could not tell you the truth about what was happening on the markets, because if they had to talk the markets up, they had to heat the markets up, because billions of dollars worth of their own shares, billions of dollars worth of rupees worth of their own shares wouldn't be worth the paper those shares were printed on if you told the truth about what was happening in Dalal Street. You had a structural compulsion to lie. Also, in the period from 2000 onwards, we started systems of private treaties with corporations, which meant that that corporation gets favorable coverage. Your reporters were banned from finding anything negative with that company or corporation. And then in 2009, we came to the situation of paid news, now well known as a term across the country. Paid news was not an aberration. It was not about a corrupt journalist or two. It was and is a very large industry. It grew in response to the Wall Street collapse, where people lost money on the market and needed to make it up by off-the-book transactions, which came to be called paid news. Yeah. So you have also, please, do one more exercise. I asked you to do this exercise of looking at where these issues which are so confronting us today, how well they were covered in the last 10 years. Here's another exercise. Please get onto the net. Take the major media companies, yeah, look at the major media companies and try finding out who are the people sitting on the boards of the top media companies. You will find an Irishman who doesn't know a word of Hindi sitting on the board of one of the largest Hindi newspapers in the planet. You will find the CEOs of the richest companies in the country sitting on the boards of directors of these big corporate media. Some of them are owners of that media. On their boards, you will find people who are in the governing forums of the World Economics Forum. On their boards, you will find the heads of top private banks. You will find ex-chairmen of the public sector units who are now with private corporations as advisors. You will find the CEOs of advertising companies. The point is that the media don't exist to function and produce good journalism for you. Like any profit-seeking organization, any corporation in the world, the bottom line is the bottom line. profit seeking is what they're about. Um, and they make that money for several people in several ways, not just because the media are interconnected in so many ways to different industries. So many. I started making a list once in 2010 of how many industries our media owners are involved in. The list went beyond 200 effortlessly, from aviation to whatever, you name it. They have such extended vested interests that's going to reflect in the newspapers. It's going to reflect in television. That's one set of things. The other things are these social issues. Look at let me say this. I don't want to hurt your feelings, but you know what? You can bloody well face the truth sometimes. Yeah. The media are the most exclusionist institution of Indian democracy. Even the judiciary, which has no reservations, which does not have quotas, still you had a Dalit Chief Justice of India. You've had two Dalit presidents of India. Yeah, the political system, there was no reservation, but you've had two presidents of India, including, in my opinion, the best president of India ever, Dr. K.R. Narayanan, who was a Dalit. In my opinion, the finest president of India in our history. And now you have another. You've had Dalit governors, Dalit vice chancellors, many Dalit ministers, chief ministers. Try finding one Dalit chief sub-editor in a major newspaper. Try finding one Dalit anchor in a major channel. They're good enough to be presidents of India, but not good enough to be chief sub-editors or chief reporters in the media, right? It is a casteist media. Face this reality, okay? I'm telling you that the problems are structural. It's not good guys and bad bad apples. It is systemic, structural exclusion that the media practice. That's why many young Dalits and Adivasis prefer going to the public service exams, where they feel that they will not be discriminated against and where there is some law, protection under law. It's very difficult to persuade them to take a career in the media seriously because they expect to be excluded, and they're quite right. That is the truth. We are a very exclusionist institution. That's the social side. Third, this country is undergoing a serious social regression. Okay, the nature of fundamentalism, obscurantism, religious obscurantism. I have been shouting to anyone who will listen for the past 10 years, long before Mr. Modi or Mr. Shah or anyone. I have been saying that long before them, what was developing as the ruling coalition of classes in this country was an alliance of socio-religious fundamentalists on the one hand and economic market fundamentalists on the other hand. Okay, so, and incidentally, the bed this happy union cohabits is called the corporate media. There are people who belong to all three of these camps. Many of the biggest politicians are giant media owners. Look at the Badals in Punjab. Look at the Marans in Tamil Nadu. You name the state, you'll see the fate, right? So you've had a non-technological convergence. I'm sure all you journalism students are learning about convergence. Here's a non-technological convergence. Giant business houses become huge media owners. Giant media houses become huge businesses. Major political figures enter both, and major business and journalism figures enter parliament. It's a very happy triangle. Right? Now, what are the things that we can do? Why did I give you such a painful picture? Because I'm telling you that if you begin by lying to yourself, you know, if all was well in the media, why do they need you? If all was well in our journalism, why do I need you? We need you. We need you, young people. We need young journalists who maybe aren't yet infected with that virus of cynicism that has, and of profit seeking that has completely imbued the corporate media. I've been teaching journalism for more than 30 years. And I look at how many students begin with so much idealism and have it beaten out of their heads after 5 years in the corporate media. Here is your struggle. The struggle is, how do I sell my labor, which is what you should do, without selling my soul? How do we sell our labor without selling our soul? That's a struggle. And by the way, I hope it's a struggle you will have and recognize all your careers, all your lives. That often at the crunch point, it boils down to that. How do I preserve my soul while selling my labor? Yeah. How many journalists now in the paid news scandal told me, how many journalists are now telling me, ringing me up and telling me their salaries have been slashed, they're being asked to do this and this and this. They have no options. You need to think about how you are going to swim in this horrible pond. You need to think about, maybe we call it guerrilla journalism. When they burn one forest, you run to the next. Yeah. But you need to bring a different set of values to journalism. You need to bring those, and we're talking about all this in the month of August, the month of Indian independence and freedom. Have a look. In 24 months from now, the Indian media, the Indian press will be 200 years old, because that was when Raja Ram Mohan Roy in 1822 founded his newspaper. By the way, it was not a Bengali newspaper. Sorry for my Bengali friends, but it was Miratul Akbar in Persian, which was then the language of the elite and the Mughal court. But from day one, Ram Mohan Roy's journalism was about the social issues, was about sati, about widow remarriage, about infant deaths. And that was the tradition you had all the way through the engagement with journalism of Bhagat Singh, of Gandhi, of Ambedkar. Let me take a moment to tell you something about the inspiring example of a journalist. Yeah, he was a journalist, and not many people know it. We all know of him as a martyr, as a political activist, as a fearless young man, as as a symbol of our freedom struggle. Yes, Bhagat Singh was all those. My dears, Bhagat Singh was a professional journalist. He wrote in innumerable journals. And please let me tell you one more thing. The man wrote in 4 languages. He wrote in 4 languages. In Punjabi, in Urdu, in Hindi, in English. He even wrote a couple of articles in Bengali when he was underground in Kolkata. And in jail, he was learning Persian to be able to write in that language. Here is a person who wrote who wrote hundreds of thousands of words in 4 languages by the time he was hanged at age 23. I began journalism at age 23. And I don't think in the last 40 years, I've come anywhere close to that kind of output, to that kind of vision of what journalism is and can be, of who you can be, of what journalism is meant to do. He constantly critiques journalism in his writings. He talks about communalism in infecting journalism as early as the 1920s. He's already talking about it. You have this unbelievable example of a guy who has addressed people in, he has published first in Akali magazine, then in Veer Pratap, then in Kirti, then in Arjun, Then in a number of magazines that no longer exist, we don't know. But that was the richness of Indian journalism. Yeah, there were also very nasty people then. There were also very loutish journalists then. There were journalists who were simply the cronies and toadies of the British imperialism, the way you have television anchors and editors today who are the cronies and toadies of the government in power. Right? By the way, the situation of journalism in India is so bad that even this government recognizes it, is defensive about it, and has set up an index monitoring committee, of which, by the way, for my sins, I am a member. What is the concern of this committee? It is concerned that India's rank in Press Freedom Index of an organization in Paris called Reporters Sans Frontières has fallen to its lowest ever at rank 142. Every year in the past 4 years, we have sunk 2 ranks. We have sunk 2 ranks because of the situation I described at the beginning of this talk. At the very beginning, I told you 60 journalists, huge numbers of FIRs, gigantic charges. It's probably twice that number now. That was a figure for May 30th. Now, but they are really worried about what an overseas agency has to say in our rankings. Like we want to be up in the, we think it's as simple as how do we improve our ease of business rankings? Let's improve our freedom of press rankings. That's not going to happen. You can't do both. You can't extend yourself into great repression of the press on the one hand, of the media, and improve your rankings, right? So that's absurd. That's the situation where you are at. That's the state of the media. That's where the state and the media are together. That's where that's the state we live in. In conclusion, there are many, there are many media experiments, including the People's Archive of Rural India, that try building a different media, that try building, we don't boast that we are competing with any of these big guys. They're behemoths. But you know what we can do? We can do journalism that engages with the great processes of our time. We can do journalism that talks to the 69% and lets the 69% of India's population, gives them a window and a voice. Or we don't become their voice. We carry their voice to you. The average Indian national daily, do you know how much news comes from rural India on its front page every day? 5-year average, 0.67% of the front page of a national daily in this country is given to rural news, according to the Center for Media Studies of Delhi, Dr. N. Bhaskara Rao's CMS, which itself is now 30 years old. The figures for television are not much better. What India does have and will have, if you get into the media with your eyes open wide and your ears listening to people, we have hundreds of excellent, extraordinarily talented journalists who can do that reporting of what's happening in the countryside. I'm credited, I'm given a lot of flattering credit for the reporting of the Agrarian Crisis. I was always conscious that there were other journalists who could do it as well as I did, but were not allowed by their media to do so. In 2006, at the height of the Agrarian Crisis, at the height of the farmers' suicides in Vidarbha, young journalists in Times of India, including my students, former students, begged the management of the Times, let us cover, a newspaper from Chennai is covering the Agrarian Crisis in Vidarbha more than we in Times of India, Mumbai are. They got a memo from the management. Dying farmers in Vidarbha do not buy the Times of India and its products. The elites of Sobo, South Mumbai, do. That was it. A year later, Mr. Vineet Jain told the New Yorker, 2 years later, Mr. Vineet Jain told the New Yorker, or 3 years later, We are not in the newspaper business. We are in the advertising business, right? They are telling you who they are. Many of them are now into the online education, into universities. The sheer cruelty of our debate over online education ignores. I want all of you on this program to know how privileged you are. In Karnataka, which is the mother of India's Silicon Valley, do you know what percentage of rural households have computers? 2%. That's less than Uttar Pradesh. Rural Karnataka, 2%. Where are the figures from? So, in key indicators of social consumption in education, Government of India National Sample Survey, June 2018. 8% of rural Kannadigas, of rural Karnataka people have access to the internet. 6.6% of those surveyed actually used the internet in the 30 days preceding the survey. Yeah. But in this period, the value of a Baiju has almost doubled. Yeah. In last 12 months, from 5.5 billion to 10.5 billion. Now, no newspapers are going to criticize or question or examine this phenomenon because those sort of companies are amongst the biggest advertisers today, right? So we're talking about profit. We're talking about that. You can be different. We can be different. There are lots of things that can be done, including fighting for diversity in media by law. Many countries have laws of diversity in the media. You cannot be the sole owner of the only newspaper in town, the only portal in town, the only film theaters in town, the only television station in town, which, by the way, is the situation that will rapidly develop in this country. So you need to fight monopoly. You need to fight for diversity in media. As journalists within this, within the beast, within the belly of the beast, you have to push the envelope. As I said, like guerrilla journalism, you slip in where you can and know that there is 170 years of history of Indian journalism, which talks about people fighting greater odds than that which we face, and who came through and delivered to their masses. The greatness of Indian journalism was the organic connection between the journalist and the illiterate masses. That was the greatness of Indian journalism. When Bal Gangadhar Tilak was sentenced to 6 years in Mandalay prison for sedition, it was not the elites, it was not the elites of Mumbai who came to his rescue. Uh, it was the textile mill workers of Mumbai who came out onto the streets. 22 were shot dead in the protests against the arrest of. They could not read what Tilak said, but they came out to defend his right to say it because they understood that he was trying to speak for them. Great journalism is tomorrow when you go out there and connect with people. In the People's Archive of Rural India, which I invite you to participate in, our journalism is about the everyday lives of everyday people. We believe that is having an influence even on the mainstream corporate media. We know from the number of people who try reproducing us or ripping off on our stories that you can have an impact on it. You can't without, I mean, it doesn't mean that you can transform anything in that way alone. You have to go the legal route, the protest route, the mass movement route. You have to go through all those, but it can be done. It's not, it's a terrible situation. It can be changed. That depends on us. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for that enthusiastic energy that you spread around all of us, trying to help us understand the context of the media in which we live, the media industry, the media in the corporate, the media in the state, and some of the ways in which we can be professional journalists, build ourselves professional journalists in the new, not the professional otherwise, but professional ways in the more meaningful sense of trying to uphold the true moral values of what journalists should be, somebody on whom the public depends and public needs.